Okay, so let's take a look at some other proteins that are found in the plasma membrane. All right, now the next group are called transport proteins. And these are proteins that are going to move substances across the plasma membrane. Because one of the problems with our plasma membrane is that larger molecules and hydrophilic molecules, and that includes water, cannot go through the plasma membrane. So we have proteins in the plasma membrane that allow these other molecules in. Because all our cells need glucose, all of our cells need water, they need some other way to get in. So one type of a transport protein is what you see here, and this is a channel protein. And these are proteins that act as pores in the plasma membrane. So it's essentially like you just stuck a straw through that plasma membrane, and what can get through the straw? Anything small enough can get through the straw, right? And so these guys are just size selective. So if you're small enough to get through, you can get through. And this is how water gets into and out of our cells, is through these channel proteins. Next, so these are showing gated channel proteins, so they're going to open and close in certain situations. And this one is showing a carrier protein. And carrier proteins are going to move specific substances across the plasma membrane. Sometimes these require energy, sometimes they don't. All right? So this is just showing the movement of a molecule through a carrier protein. So, okay, so let's move to this one. This is showing an enzyme. So enzymes are often, we already talked about enzymes, but enzymes are often found along membranes because, you can have a chemical reaction occurring outside of the cell or within inside the cell. So oftentimes they're placed along membranes for those reactions to occur. Lastly, here are receptor proteins. And receptor proteins are proteins that receive and transmit messages into a cell. All right? So this could be like a hormone binding to it or a neurotransmitter binding to it, causing some intercellular response. So let's just give an example here. So if you've ever given a speech, right, what you might notice in giving that speech is your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, your blood pressure increases, right? These are all caused by a hormone commonly known as adrenaline. We're going to call it norepinephrine in this class later on. But that's what causes all that to occur, right? So one of the things you might also notice, though, is that your mouth goes dry. Because what adrenaline does is it inhibits digestive activity. So that's why your mouth goes dry, is because you're producing less saliva. All right, now let's take a look at membrane junctions. So these are things that are going to hold cells together. All right, so the first are called tight junctions. So that's what we see up here at the top. Those are tight junctions right there. So a tight junction, this is an area where the plasma membrane of adjacent cells are fused. So we have proteins on either side, they're going to fuse together, holding those cells together. This actually prevents substances from moving in between the cells. All right, and so tight junctions are found all along the cells that line our digestive tract. Because what we secrete into our digestive tract are things like enzymes to break down proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, the foods that we eat. But we don't want those enzymes getting onto the other side here and, breaking us down, because we are also made of proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. All right. Next are desmosomes. You see a desmosome right there. So desmosomes, this is a cell junction composed of thickened plasma membranes that are joined by filaments. And these are really going to hold those cells together, but it's not, it doesn't prevent substances from moving in between the cells. These are going to hold cardiac muscle cells together. They're also going to hold skin cells together. Lastly are gap junctions. We can see over here. So it's essentially like a large channel protein between two cells. So what this does is it acts as a passageway between two adjacent cells right next to each other. And so this allows substances to move from one cell to the next. All right? And the nice thing about this is if this cell here is next to a blood supply, that cell will get oxygen and nutrients, and then those things would diffuse into the next cell through those gap junctions. So it makes it so not all cells have to be directly connected to a blood supply. And these gap junctions are found, in several different organs, but typically within that organ, not between organs. All right, so let's take a look at movement of substances across the plasma membrane. So there are two major ways in which we move substances across the plasma membrane. One is through passive mechanisms, and the other is through active mechanisms. So passive mechanisms are without energy, active mechanisms are with energy. So the first one I'm going to talk about here is diffusion. And diffusion is the movement of substances from areas of high concentrations to areas of low concentrations. You've all experienced diffusion, right? If you sprayed an air freshener or lit a candle, right? So you're going to smell that air freshener or candle in other parts of the house. And that's by diffusion process of those molecules going from a high concentration where you originally sprayed it to lower concentrations where you didn't. All right? So substances are going to move down their concentration gradients, going from high to low. So how do they do this? So diffusion is caused by the random motion of molecules and their collisions. So molecules are in constant motion. Whether we're talking about a solid or liquid or gas, they're all in constant motion. In a gas, they're moving a lot. In a liquid, they're moving a lot, but not as much as a gas. In a solid, they're hardly moving at all. All right, but they're still in motion. All right, so what happens here, if you took some salt crystals and you put them into water, what's going to happen here is essentially like the game, beginning of a game of pool. So if you ever played pool, you took all the balls, you put them into a rack, and then you hit into the rack, and hopefully that spreads the balls throughout the table. All right? And so that's microscopically what's happening here. Water molecules are in motion. They're going to bang into those salt crystal molecules, and they're going to spread them out. Well, when they get spread out here, they're going to be banged into by other water molecules, which spreads them out further and further and further and so on. And so eventually, concentrations are going to equal out. And what I mean by that is that we're going to have the same concentration of salt crystal molecules to water molecules wherever you took a sample in there. Another way to say that is it reaches equilibrium. So those salt crystal molecules are evenly spread throughout that beaker in this case. Now, what can diffuse through membranes? Well, I've already said this. Small and hydrophobic molecules can. Okay, so this is how we get oxygen into our blood and carbon dioxide out of our blood into our lungs. So we inhale about 21% oxygen, and it's going to simply diffuse from the air in our lungs into our blood. We're going to exhale out 17% oxygen. We inhale less than 1% carbon dioxide. We exhale out about 4% carbon dioxide. So it'll simply diffuse from the blood so from our blood into our lungs, and we exhale that. All right. So next is facilitated diffusion. So if you're facilitating somebody, you're helping them out. All right. So facilitated diffusion is diffusion by means of a transport protein. So this is shown right here, going from high concentration to low concentration. So facilitated diffusion can be done by either a channel protein or it can be done through a carrier protein as well. Okay, so in this case, we're going to move water soluble or hydrophilic molecules and larger molecules into cells. Okay, so lastly here. Well, not lastly, I shouldn't say, but the next type of passive mechanism is filtration. And filtration is a movement of substances through a membrane as a result of hydrostatic pressure. Okay? This will occur in our capillaries, our smallest blood vessels. All right? So what happens here is if you go from a larger tube to a smaller tube, the hydrostatic pressure or the water pressure will increase. If you ever played with a garden hose, you put your thumb over the end of it, the opening is now smaller, and so this is going to back water up behind, and that's going to increase the hydrostatic pressure in there. So that's going to force that water out. So by the time we get to our capillaries, our smallest blood vessels, the hydrostatic pressure, the blood pressure here is so high, it's going to force water and small dissolved substances through those membranes. All right? Larger molecules cannot pass through those membranes, so they'll stay in the blood, like plasma proteins and blood cells.